Neighborhood tyrant Karen Wellington stood at our gate, clipboard clutched like a weapon, pounding it against the fence while demanding immediate inspection of our livestock barn. When my wife politely declined, Karen whipped out her phone and dialed 911 with the triumphant smile of someone who thinks they hold all the cards. But there was one tiny detail: Karen didn't know the woman she just reported for non-cooperating with authorities happened to be the newly appointed police chief of our district. When the patrol car pulled up and my wife stepped out in her crisp new uniform, Karen's face went whiter than fresh paint. You think that's where this story ends? Think again. A week later, my wife launched an investigation that sent the entire HOA into panic mode. You won't believe how this ends. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. Karen thought she could call the cops to flex her power, never realizing she'd just summoned her boss. I never thought I'd be the guy fighting a homeowners association, but life has a twisted sense of humor. My name is Marcus Ashford, and 6 months ago, I inherited 15 acres of prime real estate in what used to be farmland before developers decided to build McMansions around it. The property came with a 1952 barn that my grandfather built with his own hands, complete with weathered wood siding and a rusty tin roof that sang in the rain. Most people saw it as an eyesore, but to me it was a connection to family history that I couldn't put a price on. When Sarah and I moved in, we knew the Lakeside Estates HOA wasn't thrilled about having actual agriculture in their picture-perfect suburban paradise. Sarah Chun Ashford, my wife of 3 years, had just transferred from the state police to become the new district police chief, a promotion that came with better hours and the promise of a quieter life. We figured the worst we'd face would be complaints about our chickens being too loud, or maybe some pushback about our vegetable garden not meeting the community's aesthetic standards. Karen Wellington introduced herself on our second day by marching up our driveway with a folder thick enough to use as a doorstop. She was the kind of woman who wore pearls to check the mail and treated HOA meetings like board meetings at Fortune 500 companies. Her perfectly styled blonde hair never moved, even in strong wind, and she had the unsettling habit of speaking to adults like they were children who'd forgotten their homework. Welcome to Lakeside Estates, she'd said, not bothering with pleasantries. I'm sure you're aware that this community maintains certain standards. This barn situation will need to be addressed immediately. The barn situation became Karen's obsession. Over the following weeks, she'd drive by our property twice daily, sometimes stopping to take photos with a telephoto lens that looked like something a private investigator would use. Sarah and I would watch from our kitchen window as Karen measured distances from the road, consulted thick rule books, and made notes on her ever-present clipboard. 3 weeks into what I'd started calling the Karen campaign, he escalated from passive-aggressive notes in our mailbox to showing up unannounced with inspection demands. That Tuesday morning, I was in my home office when I heard the familiar sound of her sensible heels clicking up our driveway like a countdown timer. Sarah answered the door in her casual clothes, coffee mug in hand, clearly not in the mood for another lecture about property values. Mrs. Wellington, she said politely, what can I help you with today? Karen launched into what sounded like a prepared speech about new HOA regulations requiring immediate inspection of all outbuildings for compliance with recently updated aesthetic guidelines. I'm going to need access to that barn right now, Karen concluded, pointing dramatically toward the structure like she was identifying a crime scene. The community has concerns about what might be stored in there, and frankly, your refusal to cooperate is creating suspicion among your neighbors. Sarah sat down her coffee mug with the kind of deliberate control that I'd learned meant she was getting seriously annoyed. Mrs. Wellington, I appreciate your dedication to community standards, but we're not opening our private property for inspection without proper legal documentation and reasonable notice. That's when Karen's mask slipped for the first time. Her pleasant smile twisted into something calculating, and she pulled out her phone with the slow theatrical movements of someone who thought they were about to play their ace card. Fine, she said, dialing 911. I'm reporting non-cooperation with official community oversight. This is Karen Wellington, Lakeside Estates HOA president, and I need police assistance with residents who are refusing to comply with lawful inspection requirements. I had to bite my lip to keep from laughing as Karen described Sarah as the wife who was obviously hiding something and requested immediate police response. What happened next was better than any comedy show I'd ever watched. The patrol car arrived within 10 minutes just as Karen had predicted, but when the door opened and Sarah stepped out in her brand new police chief uniform, Karen's expression went through about 5 different stages of confusion before settling on pure horror. "Good morning, Mrs. Wellington," Sarah said, professionally pulling out her notebook. "I understand you called to report non-cooperation with authorities. I'm here to investigate your complaint." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear birds chirping 3 blocks away. Karen opened and closed her mouth several times, looking like a fish trying to breathe air, while Sarah waited with a patient expression of someone who dealt with difficult people for a living. Finally, Karen managed to stammer, I didn't realize, I wasn't informed that you were." Her voice trailed off as the full implications began sinking in. But as she reached her BMW, Karen stopped and turned back toward us with an expression that sent chills down my spine. The embarrassment was gone, replaced by something much more dangerous. "This is interesting," she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "I have orders placed outside the catalog for dealing with difficult cases like this." The phrase was oddly specific, almost like code, and the way she said it made me think of business transactions rather than community disputes. As Karen drove away, I found myself remembering something my grandfather had told me years ago when I was helping him fix fence posts. "Son," he'd said, wiping sweat from his forehead, "protecting this land isn't just about being strong, it's about being smart. There are secrets here that you'll understand when the time comes." Standing in the same barn where he'd spent countless hours, I wondered if that time had finally come. Karen's behavior was too calculated to be just about HOA aesthetics. Whatever she was planning, she just made one crucial mistake by underestimating both me and the woman I'd married. The next 48 hours taught me that Karen Wellington didn't just lose gracefully, she weaponized her embarrassment. By Thursday morning, my phone was buzzing with notifications from the Lakeside Estates Facebook group, where Karen had posted a carefully crafted narrative about police corruption and family members protecting each other instead of serving the community. Her post, complete with photos of our property taken from multiple angles, painted Sarah and me as power-abusing conspirators who were hiding something sinister behind our refusal to allow routine community safety inspections. Karen's social media offensive was surgical in its precision. She shared news articles about police misconduct from other states, tagged local news outlets, and used phrases like accountability and public trust with the skill of someone who understood exactly how to manipulate public opinion. By Friday afternoon, the local newspaper had picked up the story with a headline that made my stomach drop: "New police chief's family refuses community safety inspection, conflict of interest or abuse of power." The pressure reached Sarah's office by Monday morning. Her captain called to inform her that Internal Affairs was opening a preliminary inquiry into potential conflicts of interest and that she should avoid any direct involvement in HOA matters until the investigation concluded. Sarah came home that evening looking like she'd aged 5 years in one day. 20 years building my reputation, she said, sitting heavily at her kitchen table, "and this woman might destroy it before I've even had a chance to prove myself in this job." But while Karen was busy playing media manipulation games, I was making some discoveries of my own. My neighbor Jimmy Rodriguez had been unusually quiet since the Karen incident, and when I finally cornered him at his mailbox, the reason became clear. Jimmy, a retired Army sergeant who'd always struck me as the most straightforward guy in the neighborhood, looked genuinely uncomfortable as he glanced around to make sure no one was watching us. "Marcus," he said quietly, "there's something you need to know about Karen. She's been having some very interesting phone conversations about cash payment orders and nighttime delivery schedules." Jimmy's revelation hit me like a cold slap. He explained that his insomnia had led to late-night walks around the neighborhood, during which he'd overheard Karen on her phone discussing what sounded distinctly like business transactions rather than community management. She talks about invoice adjustments, offshore payments, and something she calls international partnership logistics. Jimmy continued, his military background evident in how he'd mentally cataloged the suspicious details. "And Marcus, she keeps mentioning your property specifically. Not just the barn, but the location, the access roads, the sightlines from the street." The conversation took an even stranger turn when Jimmy showed me photos he'd been discreetly taking during his walks Karen's house showed. Signs of activity that didn't match her public persona as a grieving widow living on a fixed-income expensive cars. With out-of-state plates parked in her driveway at odd hours, delivery trucks arriving after midnight, and meetings in her backyard involving men who didn't look like they were there to discuss community bylaw. But Jimmy's most shocking revelation came as we were wrapping up our conversation. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper as he admitted, "Marcus, I have a personal reason for watching Karen so closely. 5 years ago, she was my business partner in a security consulting firm. She systematically destroyed that partnership using the same tactics she's using on you now: false accusations, media manipulation, legal pressure, and community ostracism. By the time I realized what was happening, she'd forced me into bankruptcy and taken control of all our contracts that evening." Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood knocked on our door with information that changed everything. Mrs. Blackwood was the kind of woman who noticed everything and forgot nothing, and what she'd been noticing lately had her genuinely frightened. "Dear," she said, accepting Sarah's offer of tea with shaking hands, "I've been watching Karen's activities because they remind me of things I saw during the war. She's been meeting with foreign-looking men who speak languages I don't recognize, and they've been paying special attention to your property and the old access roads your grandfather used for farming." Mrs. Blackwood's observations were detailed and disturbing. Large trucks with Canadian plates had been making regular stops near our property line, always between 2 and 4 in the morning. Men with expensive equipment had been surveying our land from the public roads, taking measurements and photos that went far beyond casual interest. Most concerning of all, Karen had been overheard discussing timeline pressures and mentioning that certain inventory transitions needed to happen before winter weather made transportation more difficult. As I helped Mrs. Blackwood to her car, she grabbed my arm with surprising strength and said something that made my blood run cold. "Your grandfather was a smart man, Marcus. He knew some people would want this land for the wrong reasons. He told me once that he'd made sure it could never be misused, but he never explained what he meant." That night, Sarah and I sat up late discussing our options. Karen had successfully neutralized Sarah's official authority through her media campaign, but she'd also revealed that our property was the center of something much larger than HOA politics. The morning after Mrs. Blackwood's visit, I called Jimmy and suggested we meet for coffee at the diner outside our neighborhood. If Karen was monitoring our activities as closely as it seemed, having this conversation away from Lakeside Estates felt like the smart move. Jimmy arrived looking like he hadn't slept much, carrying a manila folder that he kept close to his chest as we found a corner booth away from other customers. "I've been thinking about what you told me," I said, stirring sugar into my coffee, "and I need to understand exactly how Karen operates. If she destroyed your business, she'll have a playbook for destroying us too." Jimmy opened the folder and spread out documents that painted a disturbing picture of Karen's methods: bank statements, email printouts, legal correspondence, and newspaper clippings told the story of how a woman could systematically dismantle someone's life while maintaining plausible deniability. "She starts with reputation destruction," Jimmy explained, pointing to articles about his security firm's alleged mismanagement, false complaints to licensing boards, anonymous tips to local media, carefully orchestrated social media campaigns that make you look incompetent or corrupt. By the time you realize what's happening, half the community believes you're a problem that needs to be solved. The financial records were even more revealing. Karen had used her position in their partnership to redirect contracts to shell companies she controlled, while simultaneously filing complaints about Jimmy's work quality with their clients. When Jimmy tried to fight back, she'd already positioned herself as the responsible partner trying to save the business from his mismanagement. The worst part, Jimmy said, his voice heavy with old pain, was that she made it look like I was the one causing problems. Every move I made to defend myself she'd already anticipated and turned into evidence against me. But Jimmy's research hadn't stopped with his case. Over the past 5 years, he'd been quietly investigating Karen's activities and had discovered a pattern that went far beyond personal revenge. She's done this before, Marcus, at least 3 other times that I can document, always targeting properties in strategic locations, always using the same combination of legal pressure, social manipulation, and community authority to force people out. He showed me property records for parcels of land that Karen had somehow acquired after their previous owners faced similar campaigns of harassment and financial pressure. What made our situation different, according to Jimmy's analysis, was the specific attention Karen was paying to our barn and its location using satellite maps and traffic pattern studies. He determined that our property sat at the intersection of several major transportation routes with direct access to highways leading to Canada and Mexico. The old farm roads my grandfather had used for agricultural purposes provided multiple entry and exit points that would be invisible to casual observation. She's not just trying to get your land. Jimmy concluded she needs your specific piece of land for something that requires discreet transportation access. After our meeting, I drove home with my head spinning from everything Jimmy had shared, but instead of feeling defeated, I felt something my grandfather would have recognized: the focused determination that comes from finally understanding. Your opponent's strategy, Karen, had made the mistake of assuming that because she'd successfully destroyed Jimmy's business, she could use the same tactics on us. What she didn't know was that Jimmy's experience had given us a road map for recognizing and countering her moves before they could gain momentum. That afternoon, I decided to do some investigating of my own. I drove to the county records office and requested copies of all documents related to our property over the past 10 years. What I found there made my hands shake as I read through the paperwork. Someone had applied for a temporary storage facility permit using my name and forged signature dated just 2 weeks after I'd inherited the property. The application described plans for a large-scale warehousing operation that would require significant truck traffic and 24-hour access to the site. The forgery was obvious once you knew to look for it, but it had been skillfully done by someone who'd seen my real signature multiple times. More disturbing was the supporting documentation that accompanied the application, including environmental impact statements and traffic flow analyses that would have taken months to prepare. Karen hadn't just decided to target our property after we moved in. She'd been planning this operation long before my grandfather died, which meant she'd been watching our family and waiting for the right opportunity to strike. When I confronted the records clerk about the fraudulent application, she seemed genuinely surprised and concerned. "Mr. Ashford," she said, pulling up additional files on her computer, "this application has been referenced in several other permits and zoning requests over the past 6 months. If it's fraudulent, that means we have a much bigger problem than just one fake signature." She showed me documents that revealed Karen had been using the fake permit as justification for requesting road improvements, utility upgrades, and traffic pattern changes that would all benefit the kind of large-scale operation described in the forged application. But the most shocking discovery came when the clerk showed me the financial backing documentation for the storage facility project. The funding was coming from something called Lakeside International Commerce Partners, with an address that traced back to a P.O. box registered under Karen's name. The project budget listed $12 million in initial investment, with projected annual revenues of $50 million from specialized logistics services for international clientele. These weren't the numbers you'd see for legitimate warehouse operations. They were the kind of figures that suggested something much more profitable and much less legal. That evening, I shared everything I'd learned with Sarah, who listened with the focused attention of someone trained to recognize criminal enterprises. "Marcus," she said quietly, "what you're describing sounds like money laundering on a massive scale, possibly connected to smuggling operations, the international partnerships, the emphasis on transportation routes, and the need for discrete storage facilities. Karen isn't just running some small-time HOA power trip. She's operating a sophisticated criminal network, and our property is essential to whatever they're planning." The next morning brought confirmation that we were dealing with something much larger than we'd imagined. I woke up to find tire tracks in our driveway that didn't match any of our vehicles, and fresh footprints around the barn that suggested someone had been conducting a detailed inspection of the building. During the night, when I called Jimmy to report the intrusion, his response was immediate and urgent. "Marcus, if they're doing physical reconnaissance now, it means they're moving to the next phase of their operation. We need to document everything, and we need to do it fast." The evidence of nighttime surveillance on our property was the final straw that pushed Sarah from concerned wife to determined police chief. When I showed her the tire tracks and footprints around our barn, something shifted in her expression that I'd only seen a few times during our marriage. It was the look she got when someone crossed a line that transformed a personal problem into a professional obligation, Marcus, she said, pulling out her phone. I don't care what internal affairs thinks about conflicts of interest. This has moved beyond HOA harassment into criminal activity, and that makes it my jurisdiction whether Karen likes it or not. Sarah's first call was to Detective Ray Morrison, her most trusted colleague from her previous department. Morrison specialized in financial crimes and had a reputation for unraveling complex money laundering operations that other investigators couldn't crack. Within 2 hours, he was sitting in our living room reviewing Jimmy's documents and the forged permit applications I'd discovered at the county office. Sarah, Morrison said, spreading the paperwork across our coffee table, what you're showing me looks like the infrastructure for a major smuggling operation. The financial backing, the transportation requirements, and the need for discrete storage facilities. Your neighbor isn't just running a neighborhood power trip. Morrison's analysis confirmed our worst suspicions about Karen's activities. The $12 million in backing for the fake storage facility project had been traced through 3 shell companies before disappearing into offshore accounts. The traffic pattern studies included a detailed analysis of border crossing schedules and customs inspection procedures, most damning of all the specialized logistics services mentioned in the budget projections matched the language used in federal investigations of international smuggling rings. The numbers don't lie, Morrison explained. $50 million in annual revenue from a warehouse operation means they're moving something much more valuable than legitimate cargo. But Morrison brought more than just financial analysis to our situation. He'd been quietly investigating a network of properties across 3 states that showed similar patterns of fraudulent permit applications, community authority manipulation, and suspicious transportation infrastructure development. Karen Wellington's name has appeared in connection with at least 6 other locations, he told us, pulling out a map with red pins marking properties from Michigan to Florida. Each one shows the same pattern: acquire strategic transportation hubs through legal pressure and community manipulation, then use them for high-value cargo operations that avoid normal customs and border security. The scope of what Morrison was describing made me feel dizzy. We weren't dealing with a local HOA president who'd gotten carried away with power. Karen was a key player in a multi-state criminal network that had been operating for years without detection. Our property represented a crucial link in a chain that allowed illegal cargo to move seamlessly from Canada to Mexico while avoiding the kind of scrutiny that legitimate shipping operations faced at official border crossings. Sarah's decision to officially involve law enforcement triggered an immediate escalation from Karen's side. The next morning we woke up to find legal papers taped to our front door. Karen's lawyers had filed for emergency injunctive relief, claiming that our property posed immediate and substantial risks to community safety due to unpermitted structures and potentially hazardous storage activities. The filing demanded immediate access for court-appointed inspectors and threatened daily fines of $10,000 until we complied with mandatory safety protocols. The legal paperwork was impressive in its thoroughness and expensive in its preparation. Karen had been working with attorneys who specialized in property disputes and knew exactly how to use emergency procedures to force immediate action. The judge had granted a preliminary hearing for the following Tuesday, giving us less than a week to prepare our defense against accusations that were technically true but completely misleading. Yes, we had unpermitted structures because the barn predated modern permitting requirements. Yes, we were storing potentially hazardous materials because we kept gasoline for our tractor and fertilizer for our garden. But the most troubling aspect of Karen's legal offensive was how quickly it had been prepared and filed. The documents referenced site inspections and safety assessments that would have taken weeks to complete, suggesting that Karen's legal team had been developing the strategy long before our recent confrontations. She'd been building a legal case against our property while simultaneously developing her fraudulent permit applications, creating a 2-pronged attack that would either force us to sell or give her the access she needed for her smuggling operations. That afternoon, Sarah made a decision that fundamentally changed the dynamic of our conflict with Karen. I've been reactive instead of proactive, she told me as we sat in Morrison's office reviewing our legal options. Karen's been setting the agenda, choosing the battlefield, controlling the timeline. It's time for us to take the initiative. She turned to Morrison with the kind of focused intensity that had made her such an effective investigator. Ray, I want to know everything about Karen Wellington's financial activities, her business associates, and her travel patterns. If she's running a smuggling operation, there will be evidence, and I'm going to find it. Morrison's response was immediate and enthusiastic. Sarah, what you're proposing is exactly what we need to shut down this entire network, but if we're going to do this, we need to do it right. Full surveillance, financial analysis coordinated with federal agencies. Karen Wellington is about to discover that threatening a police chief's family was the biggest mistake of her criminal career. The conversation that followed involved discussions of wiretap warrants, surveillance protocols, and coordination with Homeland Security. That made it clear we were no longer dealing with a neighborhood dispute, but even as we planned our investigative counterattack, Karen was preparing her escalation. That evening, she appeared on the local news program with a carefully orchestrated interview about police corruption and abuse of authority. Sitting in her perfectly appointed living room, wearing the kind of outfit that suggested both respectability and victimhood, she painted herself as a concerned community leader fighting against law enforcement officers who thought they were above the rules that governed everyone else. I'm just trying to protect our neighborhood, she said, with practiced sincerity, but apparently that makes me a target for intimidation by people who should be serving our community, not threatening it. The news segment ended with Karen making a direct appeal to viewers about the importance of holding public officials accountable, complete with our address displayed on screen and an invitation for concerned citizens to contact the city council about police misconduct. By the time the broadcast finished, our phone was ringing with calls from reporters, activists, and angry citizens who'd been convinced that Sarah was using her position to protect illegal activities on our property. As we watched Karen's performance on the evening news, I realized that we'd reached the point my grandfather had warned me about, the moment when protecting our land would require more than just legal maneuvering or community politics. It would require the kind of strategic thinking that could outmaneuver someone who'd spent years perfecting the art of destroying people's lives while maintaining her reputation. The question was whether we were smart enough to beat Karen at her own game before she destroyed everything we'd worked to build. Detective Morrison's investigation moved faster than I'd expected. Within 72 hours, he'd assembled a file that painted Karen Wellington as a central figure in what federal agents were calling Operation Northern Pipeline, a sophisticated smuggling network that moved everything from counterfeit goods to illegal drugs along a corridor stretching from Montreal to Mexico City. Our property wasn't just conveniently located for this operation, it was essential. The old farm roads my grandfather had maintained provided the perfect invisible highway for cargo that needed to avoid official inspection, while the barn offered secure storage for goods and transit between major urban markets. But the scope of Karen's operation was even more staggering than Morrison had initially estimated. Financial records seized from her shell companies revealed annual profits exceeding $50 million, with individual shipments worth millions moving through properties she controlled or influenced. She wasn't just facilitating smuggling, she was running a logistics empire that coordinated transportation, storage, security, and distribution for criminal organizations across 2 countries. The HOA presidency had been perfect cover, giving her legitimate reasons to monitor property developments and transportation patterns while maintaining her reputation as a concerned community leader. Morrison's briefing that Wednesday morning included satellite photos, financial flowcharts, and communication intercepts that read like something from a crime thriller. Karen Wellington has been building this network for over a decade, he explained, pointing to a timeline that showed her systematic acquisition of strategic properties. She identifies locations with the right geographic advantages, then uses a combination of legal pressure, community manipulation, and financial incentives to gain control. But just as Morrison was explaining how the federal case would unfold, my phone rang with news that changed everything about our situation. It was a lawyer I'd never heard of calling from a firm in Boston that specialized in estate law. Mr. Ashford, he said in the formal tone that lawyers use when they're about to complicate your life, I'm calling about a recently discovered codicil to your grandfather's. Will we need to schedule an immediate meeting to discuss legal requirements that affect your property ownership? The timing seemed impossibly coincidental, but the lawyer insisted that the discovery was legitimate and Urgent that afternoon. Sarah and I sat in the law offices of Whitman Sterling and Associates, staring at documents that made me question everything I thought I knew about my grandfather's legacy. The codicil, written in my grandfather's handwriting and properly witnessed, contained instructions that had been sealed until external pressures threatened the integrity of the family property. Inside the sealed envelope was a hand-drawn map of our land marked with symbols and codes that meant nothing to me, along with a note that made my hands shake. Marcus, if you're reading this, it means someone is trying to take our land for the wrong reasons. Check the oak bookshelf in the barn, third shelf from the top, behind the farming almanac. The lawyer explained that the codicil contained provisions that would make selling or significantly modifying our property legally impossible without completing a complex process that could take years. More importantly, it referenced historical documentation that could potentially designate our land as a protected cultural site under federal preservation laws. Your grandfather was aware that this property had historical significance beyond its agricultural value, the lawyer continued. That evening, Sarah and I made our way to the barn with flashlights and the growing sense that we were about to uncover something that would fundamentally change our understanding of the conflict with Karen. The oak bookshelf my grandfather had mentioned was exactly where he'd described, built into the back wall of the barn behind stacks of farming equipment behind the row of almanacs. My fingers found a metal box that had been carefully concealed in a hollow space carved into the wooden shelf. Inside the box were documents that took my breath away. Land surveys from the 1850s show our property as a station on the Underground Railroad, with detailed maps of tunnel systems that had been used to help enslaved people escaped to Canada. Correspondence between my great-great-grandfather and abolitionists, describing the strategic importance of the location for freedom transportation. Most shocking of all, recent geological surveys have shown that many of those historical tunnels were still intact beneath our property, creating the kind of hidden transportation infrastructure that would be invaluable for modern smuggling operations. The final document in the box was a letter addressed to me personally, dated just 6 months before my grandfather's death. Marcus, it read, if you're reading this, it means the land vultures have finally made their move. This property has been in our family for 5 generations because it serves a purpose that goes beyond farming. The Underground Railroad tunnels beneath our barn represent some of the most historically significant freedom infrastructure in the region, and they must never be used for the opposite purpose. I've seen signs that certain people are becoming interested in our land for the wrong reasons, and I've made legal arrangements to protect it. As Sarah and I sat in the barn reading my grandfather's letter by flashlight, the pieces of Karen's obsession finally fell into place. She didn't just want our property for its surface transportation advantages. She knew about the underground tunnel system and understood that it would provide perfect concealment for smuggling operations that needed to move large quantities of goods without any possibility of detection. The historical significance that my grandfather had worked to protect was exactly what made our land so valuable to her criminal network. But my grandfather's revelations also meant that we now had legal weapons that Karen couldn't have anticipated. If our property could be designated as a historical preservation site, it would become virtually impossible for anyone to develop it for commercial purposes. The Underground Railroad connection alone would trigger federal protection protocols that would make Karen's smuggling plans completely unfeasible. The question was whether we could navigate the legal process quickly enough to stop her before she decided that, if she couldn't control our land, she'd find a way to destroy it. Instead, the morning after our discovery in the barn, Karen Wellington made her first major mistake. Instead of disappearing or backing down when she realized we'd uncovered the historical significance of our property, she doubled down on her aggression in a way that revealed just how desperate she'd become. At 7 a.m. I found her standing in our driveway with 2 men I'd never seen before, both wearing expensive suits and the kind of cold expressions that made me immediately think of organized crime. Mr. Ashford, Karen called out as I approached, her voice carrying none of its usual calculated politeness. We need to discuss a reasonable resolution to our property dispute before this situation becomes unnecessarily complicated for everyone involved. The threat was barely veiled, and the presence of her companions made it clear that Karen had moved beyond legal maneuvering into something much more dangerous. But what she didn't know was that Morrison had anticipated exactly This kind of escalation. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message that simply read, "Package delivered," which meant that federal surveillance equipment had been monitoring our property since midnight. Every word of Karen's threatening conversation was being recorded by agents who were positioned to intervene if the situation turned violent, but Karen's desperation led her to reveal information that the federal investigation had been trying to confirm for months. "You have no idea what you're interfering with," she continued, her carefully maintained facade cracking under pressure. "This operation involves partnerships that span multiple countries and generate revenue streams that your little farm could never compete with. The smart thing would be to accept our generous offer and walk away before you find yourself dealing with people who don't have my patience." One of her companions stepped forward and handed me a folder containing what appeared to be a purchase offer for our property at 3 times its assessed value. The offer itself was suspicious enough, but the supporting paperwork revealed details about Karen's operation that she hadn't intended to share. The purchasing entity was listed as Northern Gateway Logistics, with corporate addresses in Toronto, Buffalo, and Tajana that formed a perfect corridor for cross-border smuggling. The timeline for the purchase completion was listed as immediate, with financing already secured through what the documents described as international investment partnerships. Most revealing of all, the intended use was described as specialized transportation and storage facilities for time-sensitive cargo operations. After Karen and her associates left, Sarah made a phone call that set in motion the final phase of the federal investigation. "Morrison," she said, putting the call on speaker so I could hear, "they just handed us everything we need to move against the entire network. Karen's getting sloppy because she's running out of time, and her international partners are putting pressure on her to secure our property immediately." Morrison's response was immediate and decisive. "Sarah, we're moving to the arrest phase. Karen Wellington and her associates are about to discover that threatening federal witnesses was the final mistake of their criminal careers." But before the federal agents could move against Karen, Jimmy Rodriguez appeared at our door with information that added an even darker dimension to our understanding of her criminal activities. "Marcus," he said, his military bearing more pronounced than I'd ever seen it, "I've been doing some research into Karen's personal history, and what I found changes everything about why she's so desperate to control your property." He pulled out a folder containing newspaper clippings, police reports, and insurance documents that painted a disturbing picture of Karen's transformation from grieving widow to criminal mastermind. The official story of Karen's husband's death had always been a tragic car accident on a rainy night 3 years ago, but Jimmy's investigation had uncovered inconsistencies in the police report, insurance payouts that seemed unusually large, and witness statements that had been mysteriously amended after the initial investigation. "Marcus," Jimmy said quietly, "I don't think Karen's husband died in an accident. I think she killed him when he discovered her criminal activities and threatened to expose her. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. Her husband had been asking questions about Karen's financial activities in the weeks before his death, and he'd made appointments with both a divorce lawyer and an FBI field office that he never lived to keep." But Jimmy's most shocking revelation was that Karen's entire HOA presidency had been built on a foundation of lies and manipulation. The other board members weren't just complicit in her activities. Most of them didn't exist. "I've been checking voter registrations, property records, and social media profiles," Jimmy explained. "Half the people listed as HOA board members are either dead, fictional, or haven't lived in this area for years. Karen has been operating a fake homeowners association to give herself the legal authority she needed to pressure property owners and justify her inspection demands." That afternoon, Morrison called with news that the federal investigation was moving into its final phase. "Karen Wellington is about to discover that we've been watching her activities for months," he said. "We've identified her international partners, tracked her financial networks, and documented enough criminal activity to shut down the entire operation. But, Marcus, we need you and Sarah to stay safe for the next 48 hours while we coordinate arrests across multiple states and countries." But even as Morrison was assuring us that Karen's criminal empire was about to collapse, events were moving faster than anyone had anticipated. That evening, as Sarah and I were reviewing the federal protection protocols, we heard vehicles approaching our property. Looking out our window, we saw Karen's BMW followed by 2 large trucks with Canadian plates, the same vehicles that Mrs. Blackwood had been reporting for weeks. Karen was making her final move, and it was clear that she'd decided if she couldn't control our property through legal means, she would take it by force. As the federal agents led Karen away in handcuffs, her final words carried an unmistakable threat: "This operation involves people who don't accept failure, and they will not let you destroy years of planning because of your sentimental attachment to family history." The FBI raids that followed Karen's arrest were more extensive than anyone had imagined. Within 6 hours, federal agents had executed coordinated arrests across 12 states and 3 countries, dismantling what authorities described as one of the largest cross-border smuggling operations in North American history. Morrison called us that evening with updates that read like something from an international crime thriller. "Marcus, what you and Sarah uncovered led to the seizure of over $200 million in illegal goods, the arrest of 43 suspects, and the discovery of smuggling tunnels and storage facilities from Vancouver to Tajana. But the most satisfying part of the federal operation was what they found hidden on our own property using ground-penetrating radar in the historical maps from my grandfather's secret box. Agents discovered that Karen had been using our underground railroad tunnels for the past 18 months, storing millions of dollars in contraband in chambers that had once sheltered people seeking freedom. The irony wasn't lost on anyone involved. The same passages that had been used to help enslaved people escape to Canada were being exploited by criminals to move drugs and stolen goods in the opposite direction. The evidence recovered from the tunnels beneath our barn was staggering in its scope and organization. Agents found detailed logistics records showing that over $15 million in illegal merchandise had been processed through our property since Karen gained access. Through a combination of legal pressure and physical intrusion, she'd been using sophisticated hydraulic lifts to move cargo between the surface and the underground chambers while maintaining perfect deniability through her position as HOA president. The operation was so well organized that it had gone completely undetected by local law enforcement for over a year. But perhaps the most revealing discovery was Karen's office, hidden in the deepest section of the tunnel system and accessible only through a concealed entrance in our barn's foundation. The office contained financial records, communication equipment, and strategic planning documents that painted a picture of criminal ambition that went far beyond simple smuggling. Karen hadn't just been facilitating illegal transportation, she'd been building a criminal infrastructure that would have eventually controlled a significant portion of black market commerce between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. The personal cost of Karen's criminal empire became clear during her interrogation, which Morrison shared with us in general terms. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of spending the rest of her life in federal prison, Karen finally admitted to murdering her husband when he discovered her activities and threatened to expose her to authorities. She described it as a business decision. Morrison told us, his voice heavy with disgust, when her husband found evidence of her smuggling operation and scheduled a meeting with the FBI, she decided that eliminating him was more cost-efficient than shutting down her criminal enterprise. Karen's confession revealed the depth of her psychological transformation. From community leader to criminal mastermind, she'd started with small-scale fraud and property manipulation, but the financial rewards had gradually corrupted her sense of morality until she was capable of murdering the person closest to her to protect her illegal operations. She told the interrogators that she'd lost everything once when her husband died the first time from cancer, and she was determined never to feel powerless again. Morrison explained the control and financial security that crime provided became more important to her than any human relationship or moral consideration. But the federal investigation also vindicated my grandfather's foresight in protecting our property through legal mechanisms that Karen couldn't have anticipated. The historical significance documentation that he'd carefully preserved proved essential in establishing federal protection for the Underground Railroad tunnels, ensuring that they could never again be used for criminal purposes. Within a week of Karen's arrest, our property was officially designated as a National Historic Site with permanent federal oversight to prevent any future exploitation of its historical resources. The legal protections that my grandfather had put in place also meant that we were entitled to significant compensation for the damage that Karen's operation had caused to our property and our lives. A federal government seizure of her criminal assets resulted in a settlement that not only covered all our legal expenses, but also provided funding for the Marcus Ashford Heritage Foundation dedicated to preserving underground railroad sites and educating communities about the ongoing importance of protecting historical resources. But the most meaningful aspect of our victory over Karen's criminal enterprise was the impact it had on our community and our understanding of civic responsibility. The revelation that our HOA had been a front for international smuggling operations prompted a complete reorganization of community governance, with new transparency requirements and citizen oversight mechanisms that would prevent similar deception in the future. Sarah and I were asked to lead the new Lakeside Estates Community Association with a mandate to ensure that local authority would never again be used to facilitate criminal activity 6 months after Karen's conviction and sentencing to life in federal prison. Sarah and I stood in our barn looking at the restored underground railroad tunnels, now officially protected and preserved for future generations. The chambers that had once hidden smuggled goods were being converted into an educational museum that would teach visitors about both the historical significance of the Underground Railroad and the importance of community vigilance in preventing criminal exploitation of historical resources. The irony of our situation wasn't lost on either of us. We'd moved to Lakeside Estates seeking a quiet life away from the complexities of urban law enforcement, only to find ourselves at the center of an international criminal investigation. But in fighting to protect our family's land, we'd also helped preserve an important piece of American history and demonstrated that ordinary citizens could make a difference when they refused to be intimidated by people who believed that wealth and power put them above the law. The final chapter of our conflict with Karen Wellington came during her sentencing hearing, when the federal judge took the unusual step of acknowledging our role in exposing her criminal enterprise. Mr. and Mrs. Ashford, the judge said, your courage in standing up to organized criminal activity and your commitment to preserving historical resources serve as an example of the civic responsibility that makes our justice system possible. This case demonstrates that criminals, no matter how sophisticated their operations or extensive their resources, cannot succeed when faced with citizens who are willing to fight for what's right. As we drove home from the courthouse that day, Sarah and I reflected on how our understanding of community responsibility had been fundamentally changed by our experience with Karen. We'd learned that protecting what we value requires more than just legal documents or good intentions. It requires the willingness to stand up to people who believe that other people's rights are obstacles to be overcome, rather than principles to be respected. Our grandfather's wisdom about protecting the land with intelligence rather than force had proven correct, but it had also taught us that sometimes the most important battles are the ones that force you to discover strength you didn't know you possessed. If the story resonated with you, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to Haber Stories for more tales of justice, courage, and the power of doing what's right. Sometimes we all need reminding that good people can win when they refuse to give up. Sometimes the most important battles we fight aren't the ones we choose, but the ones that choose us. Marcus and Sarah's story reminds us that standing up for what's right often requires more courage than we think we possess, but reveals strength we never knew we had when faced with people who believe power gives them the right to take what isn't theirs. Ordinary citizens can make an extraordinary